In this video, I have compiled the best tips, strategies, and techniques to dramatically increase your English SAT score. And these are the same tips I used when I scored in the 99th percentile on the PSAT, after consistently scoring in the 70th percentile on practice tests just a few months before. Before we do anything, we should first understand that the SAT is 100% objective, meaning that 3 of the answer choices are 100% wrong for a reason, and it's our job to figure out what that reason is. So shift your mindset from which answer choice looks correct to what's wrong with this answer choice. It's a lot easier to find something wrong with an answer choice than to prove that it's right. With this in mind, you should be clicking this button the moment you enter the test. Another very useful tool is the flag tool. You should use this one if you're wasting too much time on a question and want to come back to it after you finished all the other questions. And since every question is worth the same number of points, you're going to want to start with your strengths. That way you can solidify those points and make sure you have enough time to complete the more difficult questions. A common question people have is whether they should show the clock or not. I personally always keep the clock on so I know if I should adjust my pace or not. The clock also shows up no matter what when there's 5 minutes left, so I would just get used to the clock on the practice tests and use it as a tool rather than something that increases your anxiety. And unless you have extra time taking the test, I would forget about the highlighting tool unless it's a super difficult question because it takes a long time to highlight and add notes. The final tip I have is that if you're easily distracted by clicking or typing noises during the test, you can use an artificial background noise. I recommend either this one or this one, and you can find both of those in the description. Here's a quick overview of how the English is structured. There's 4 different categories. The first one being craft and structure, then information and ideas, then standard English convention, then expression of ideas. There's a total of 13 different question types, and I'm going to go over every single one in this video. You should also know that English is divided into 2 modules, and depending how well you do in the first one will decide the difficulty of the next one. Each module has 27 questions, and you're given 32 minutes. The first question on the SAT is going to be a words and context question. The way the text is usually formatted is a statement and then a restatement, with each of the sentences conveying the same message. The goal is to figure out the direction of the sentence with the blank and then create a test word you can use against the answer choices. So let's read the question. Researchers have struggled to pinpoint specific causes for hiccups, which happens when a person's diaphragm contracts blank. However, neuroscientist Kimberly Whitehead has found that these uncontrollable contractions may play an important role in helping infants regulate their breathing. This is a perfect example of a statement and then a restatement because the first statement describes the contractions as unknown, meaning that we are trying to figure out what is going on with the contractions, and the restatement describes the contractions as uncontrollable. So we can use uncontrollable as a test phrase in this example. You can then test the word uncontrollable against all the answer choices and see which one has the strongest match. The reason we want to create a test phrase before looking at the answer choices is because people often become attached with a wrong answer choice without first thinking logically about the question. Since this question is fairly easy, you can probably assume that the answer is involuntary, but let's assume we don't know what these words mean. What we want to do is dissect the words into prefixes, roots, and suffixes, then figure out what they mean. In this example, involuntary can be broken down into the prefix in, meaning opposite of, the root volontaire, meaning one's free will, and the suffix y, indicating a state or condition. If you don't know the meaning of individual parts of a word, try thinking of other words that have the same parts. In this case, the word volunteer has the same root. And if you know what volunteer means, a person who freely offers to take part in a task, you'll be able to assume that voluntar means one's free will. The broken words all put together pretty much translates to not controllable or uncontrollable, meaning it's a very strong match with our test phrase. Just to be safe, I would look at the rest of the answer choices, apply the same process if needed, and ensure that they're all incorrect before moving on to the next question. Most people assume you want to study SAT vocab words to improve at these, but the amount of vocab words that the SAT can use, combined with how little of the test is vocab, makes this a fairly ineffective use of your time. So unless you're aiming for an elite score, I would study the most common prefixes, roots, and suffixes. The next type of questions are purpose questions. You first want to skim the text, and as you read it, ask yourself what insight it gave you as a reader. Are they trying to convey, emphasize, demonstrate, or describe something? Once you think you know, look at the answer choices and apply a test phrase to see if it matches. A tip I found helpful was to pay extra attention to transition words to help see the direction of the text. And once you can see the journey the text is taking you through, you'll be able to identify the purpose much easier. For these questions, you also want to think about what the author is trying to convey to the reader. And again, before you look at the answer choices, read the question, read the text, and use your brain to come up with an original answer, then compare that to the choices. Structure questions are similar to purpose questions, but instead of finding the why, we are going to find the how. The first thing I do is skim the text, then I chunk the text into its main messages. There's usually one shift in the text direction, and you'll know this exists when every answer choice has the words and then, signifying a change in the text direction. The next step is to summarize the main message in each segment of the text. Then combine these into a one-sentence summary and use it as a test phrase against the answer choices. A final tip is to pay attention to any transition words to identify a shift in the text's direction. This next question type involves two texts and asks you to compare the point of views between them. In this example, it's asking what people from text 2 would respond to the findings in text 1. The first objective is to figure out what the findings are. Since we only have to know enough information to answer this one question, everything in text 1 that isn't the findings is irrelevant. The findings can be simplified down to, Fan thinks if companies merge, it will negatively affect consumers because prices will increase. The next objective is to figure out what text 2 would say about this statement. The first sentence in text 2 states that the harmful effects that consumers face are short term. Now we have to return to the question, what would text 2 respond to the findings in text 1? Well, they would say those findings are not reflective of reality because they only show the short term effects. Any answer that does not talk about time is most likely wrong, and this leaves us with choice C. Moving on to the second section of the test, which is information and ideas. This is the hardest section of the test, especially for people who struggle with reading comprehension. But unlike the old SAT, you don't need to know every detail of the story, you only need to know what the question is asking for. The command of textual evidence questions are either literature with answer choices as quotes, and for those ones, just pick the quote that reinforces the author's claim, or it could be a research study that uses data to back up claims. For this example, we're going to use a research question. The question asks which evidence will support the team's idea. So first, we must skim the text for the team's idea, which can be found right here, where the team hypothesizes that iridescent insects are less visible to other animals. The team's experiment was to see if people could spot more iridescent beetle wings or non-changing blue and purple wings when walking along a path. So now we can use our mind to decide what result of data would support the claim. And in this case, if people saw less iridescent wings than non-changing colored wings, then it would support the idea that iridescent wings are less visible to animals. The next question type is similar to the last. The only difference is that instead of us deciding what the data should be, we are given the data and have to decide how to present it. My strategy for these questions is to skim the data, whether it be a table or a graph, and look at the title so you know what the topic of the question is about. Then read the question, then read the text. The titles tell us that the bar graph is about the percentages of farmers who are women in different sections of Ando, and it's organized by 3 different crop types to make it even more difficult. The next step is to see what the question is asking for, which is for us to complete the text, and now we can read the text. At the beginning, it usually gives us context, but since we already looked at the graph, we can just skim over this part. It then says that sometimes the majority of farmers were women, and it wants us to finish the example. Now we can look back at the data and find an example in which the majority of farmers were women. There's only 2 bars that show that more than 50% of women were farmers, which were farmers in North and South Ando that cultivated non-root vegetables. Now we can check this answer with the answer choices. And when you choose your answer, you must make sure it's right for 2 reasons. The first one being that the answer logically answers the question, and the second one is that the data reflects what is shown in the picture. And if either of these are wrong, you can eliminate that answer choice. Answer choice A says that most farmers who cultivated cereals and most farmers who cultivated non-root vegetables in South Andal were women. While the second part is true, most farmers that cultivated cereals in South Andal were not women, so we can eliminate this choice because it doesn't accurately reflect the data. Choice B says that more women in Central Ando mainly cultivated root crops than mainly cultivated cereals. First of all, this is not true because the percent of women in Central Ando farming root crops is less than the percent farming cereals in Central Ando. And second, this doesn't logically complete the text by giving us an example of a crop that is mostly cultivated by women. Choice C says that most farmers who mainly cultivated non-root vegetables in North and South Ando were women. which checks both requirements, and if I was at this stage on a test, I would not even check the last one. The next question type is central ideas and details. To clear up any confusion, the central idea is the content and main message of a text, while the purpose is the author's intent or goal in writing the text. Also, the main idea and central idea mean the same thing. Here's how to approach a main idea question. First, identify the task, which is to find the main idea. The main idea is supposed to be a sentence that encompasses the message of the whole text. Now we can look at the text. In West Africa, Jalis have traditionally been keepers of information about families' histories and records of important events. They often served as teachers and advisors, too. New technologies have changed some aspects of the role today, but Jalis continue to be valued for knowing and protecting their people's stories. Now let's summarize the message of the text in one sentence. I would summarize this as, the role of Jalis has changed, but they are still important, which most closely matches with choice A. Choice B says although Jalis have many roles, many of them like teaching best. While this could be true, it doesn't state it in the text and it doesn't represent the main idea. That one is too specific and can't be backed by the text. Choice C says Jalis have been entertaining the people within their communities for centuries. This could also be true, but that's just one statement about Jalis and is also too specific to be the main idea. Choice D says technology can do some things Jalis used to be responsible for, which again is a random detail that doesn't encompass the whole text. Detailed questions are much easier in my opinion. You just have to make sure you're strict when you're eliminating answer choices. These problems typically ask one specific question. For this example, it's what is true about mother? And you have to find the answer somewhere in the text. The answer choices try to throw you off by being almost correct, but not quite. And for these questions, you don't need to create a test phrase to use against the answer choices. You just look at the choices and then check them with the text. Choice A says, she wishes that more ladies would visit her. In the first sentence, it literally says, mother did not spend time visiting people or waiting for them to visit her. Choice B says, birthdays are her favorite occasion. The text says mother made poetry for her kids' birthdays, but it doesn't say birthdays were her favorite occasion, so we can eliminate this. Choice C says, she creates stories and poems for her children, which is true, and it says both of these things. Choice D says, reading to her children was her favorite activity. And since the text never mentions her having a favorite activity, we can't confirm this. This is a very difficult inference question, but I believe anyone can solve it if they approach it the right way. These questions always ask which choice most logically completes the text, and a lot of the time you can skim the text and the answer is obvious. But the hard questions always have many moving parts that distract you from the answer. So this is how I would approach this question. While I read the text, I'll translate each sentence into a shorter, dumbed-down version of the original text so that I can remember it easier. And for this example, I'm going to use the highlighter tool, which I'm not a fan of, but for this exercise, it's fine. A team of biologists led by J, A, and S investigated a mechanism that allows thale crest plants to accelerate flowering at high temperatures. I would translate this into, biologists think mech allows plant T to flower faster at high temp. They replaced the protein ELF3 in the plants with a similar protein found in another species, stiff brome, that, unlike A. thaliana, displays no acceleration in flowering at increased temperatures. And this can be dumbed down to, they swapped plant T's protein ELF3 with the plant's protein that doesn't show change in flowering speed at high temp. A comparison of unmodified A. thaliana plants with the altered plants showed no difference in flowering at 22 degrees Celsius, but at 27 degrees Celsius, the unmodified plants exhibited accelerated flowering, while the altered ones did not, which suggests that blank. This can be simplified down to, once temp is 27, then regular plant T flowers faster, but plant T without ELF3 doesn't. With these simplified notes, it's much easier to see that this protein ELF3 is the mechanism that allows this plant to flower faster at high temperatures, which is also probably the conclusion that logically completes the text. Now we can look at our answer choices. Choice A says, temperature-sensitive accelerated flowering is unique to A. thaliana. Although this is possible, it doesn't logically complete the text because the focus of the text isn't about whether this is unique, and this fact can't be proven true with the text. Choice B says, A. thaliana increases ELF3 production as temperatures rise. We also can't prove this with the text. The direction of the text points to the fact that ELF3 causes plant T to flower faster at higher temperatures, but never talks about increasing production of ELF3. So we don't know this, and it doesn't logically follow the text. Choice C says, ELF3 enables A. thaliana to respond to increased temperatures. This is true. We saw that when ELF3 is swapped with another protein, plant T doesn't flower faster at high temperatures, which shows that ELF3 is the mechanism that enables plant T to flower faster at increased temperatures. Choice D says temperatures of at least 22 degrees Celsius are required for A. thaliana to flower. We do not know for certain if the plant needs a 22-degree environment to flower, and in any case, we're testing for flowering acceleration, not when the plant starts to flower. The factor being tested is the presence of ELF3 protein, and therefore the conclusion must relate to whether there is any difference in flowering acceleration when this protein is present. On these tougher questions, try not to get overwhelmed, just dissect the text, map out the direction, and if you can't eliminate any answer choices, then you probably missed something. An extra tip for really all questions on the SAT is to pretend to be interested when you're reading the questions. If you're trying to be interested in the text, you're going to be more focused and retain more information. The next group of questions is Standard English Convention, which is the easiest section to improve because all you have to do is memorize grammar rules. Each question type can only test you on one topic, so the first thing you want to do is identify what the question is testing. The easiest way to do this is by looking at the answer choices. Once you know the question type, you can apply any relevant tips. Here's a breakdown for each question type. You'll know its subject-verb agreement if different answer choices contain singular and plural forms of the same verb. You will know its pronoun antecedent agreement when one answer choice uses a singular pronoun like it, while another answer choice uses a plural pronoun like they. You'll know its testing verb forms if different answer choices use different verb tenses, like past, present, and future, and if some choices add or remove helping verbs. You'll know its subject modifier replacement when the blank is longer than a few words, and the choices rearrange the same words or phrases. You'll know it's testing plural and possessive nouns if the answer choices add or remove apostrophes, or if the choices change the placement of apostrophes. You can identify boundary questions if the answer choices add punctuation, remove punctuation, or offer different punctuation marks. Here are some quick-fire tips for each question type. For subject-verb agreement, if all three verbs are plural, the one that's singular is correct, and vice versa. If you don't know if a verb is plural or singular, say he and then the verb. For example, he are or she are doesn't sound right, but they are does. So you can check that the verb are is plural. And saying they have been or they were both sound right. So these two are also plural. For subject-verb agreement, cross out everything that precedes the word of. If two answer choices are exactly the same, except that one uses a period and the other uses a semicolon, you can eliminate both because the SAT wants to stay 100% objective, and using one or the other can be seen as subjective. If the text is stating a fact, all verbs are in the simple present tense. For verb questions, look at the other verbs in the text. So for example, if you see the verb is, the text is in the present, and if you see was, it's in the past. But you should also pay attention to see if the text changes time periods. If a sentence contains who, what, when, where, or how, or hypotheticals like would or could, it's a question. If the question is a boundary question, analyze the text to decide if the statements surrounding the blank are dependent or independent clauses. Grammar questions on the hard modules should be looked at carefully because it's easy to make mistakes. So if you're not 100% sure, read it over again in your head to see if it sounds right. Transition questions are the next type of question, and they always ask the same thing. Which choice completes the text with the most logical transition? The strategy that Khan Academy recommends is to summarize the text in your own words, identify the relationship between the passage's ideas, and select the transition word that matches the relationship. If you want to get better at understanding transition words, make sure you understand every word that's currently showing on the screen. If you aren't sure about a few of them, you can write them down and review them. The last question on the English SAT is going to be a rhetorical synthesis question. These questions give notes and a goal, but most of the time you don't even need to read the notes to accomplish the goal. For example, in this question, the goal is to summarize the study. Now we can just look at the answer choices and decide which one accomplishes the goal best. Choice A says, for a 2019 study, researchers from the UK and Germany collected data on auks' attempts to land at cliffside nesting sites in different wind conditions. While this explains the methodology, it doesn't summarize the study as a whole. Choice B says, Emily Shepard and colleagues wanted to know the extent to which wind affected auks' success in landing at cliffside nesting sites, so they conducted a study. This presents the study, but doesn't mention anything else, so we can eliminate this as well. Choice C says, knowing that auks often need multiple attempts to land at their cliffside nesting sites, Emily Shepard studied the birds' success rate, which was only around 20% in some conditions. This is just the data from the study, which doesn't match the goal. And choice D says, Emily Shepard's 2019 study of auk success in landing at cliffside nesting sites showed that as the wind conditions intensified, the bird success rate decreased. This choice introduces what the study is about and what the study discovered, which sounds like a much better summary than the other options. First of all, if you made it this far, I appreciate you, and I think you'd find great value in my free community in the description. You can ask questions or give advice to other people who are also trying to improve their SAT score.